All right, as you work your way back to the tables, we want to go into the final section of our conversation today. And we'll have three pieces that we want to cover still. We want to hear from three of the developers are here, and we'll have a chance to hear from each of them in a second. We'll then get a little bit on next steps in the leasing process and just a quick summary from our conversation today. And then finally, we'll then close out, and we will turn the mic back over to members of the public who are here so we can hear their thoughts. So let's turn to developers for folks who have won leases and are moving forward. So we have three in particular who are here today, and first we'll hear from Francesco and Norio, who's Executive Program Manager with US Wind. Yours.
Hello everyone, my name is Francesco Norio, Executive Program Manager for US Wind. So let's start with who is US Wind. We are a developer, we are a company incorporated in Massachusetts. Actually, we have two leases, one off the coast of Maryland. There were two of them, then they were merged together. And then we have one in New Jersey. The one in Maryland is around 80,000 acres. The one in New Jersey is 183,000 acres. Someone calls this lease the sleeping giant. So, going to where we are in our development process, I know the focus is on New Jersey and New York, but very quickly, where we are in Maryland, we have achieved some interesting milestones. The first one is the OREC in Maryland, is I believe the most important one because it means that we have a buyer for our energy. Then we have submitted and received approval on some other documents, such as the survey plan. We have completed some geophysical and geotechnical survey for the foundations and for the export cable. We have completed the preliminary engineering of the wind farm, the final engineering of the metmast. We have submitted and received approval from BOEM on the site assessment plan. And our metmast, that is the asset that is used for data collection, is actually fabricated. With respect to New Jersey, we were waiting for the New Jersey Administrative Code to be out. So we are in early stage of development in New Jersey. So actually we are defining the engineering for the wind farm. So we have defined already the nameplates that we want to achieve, the turbine sites and the model. We have defined the foundations that we would like to use for that area. We have also completed a screening of the potential point of interconnections. Actually, there are two good substations, I believe, in New Jersey. We also defined the routes from the lease up to the onshore area. We have defined, of course, the type of interconnection that we want, AC versus DC. We have also completed a screening of the available ports and infrastructure. I believe there are some interesting areas here. One in New Jersey, for example, I believe is Paulsboro. There are two locations in New York as well. Based on our preliminary analysis, Military Ocean Terminal at Bayonne and Red Hook are some very good locations here in New York for locating a marshalling port and a manufacturing port. And we have also discussed our project plans with the New Jersey Economic Development Authority and the Department of Environmental Protection in order to be aligned with our project plans and the requirements from the agencies. What are the next steps? Well, with respect to Maryland, the next step is the construction operation plan that we have discussed in the morning. This took a bit of time for us, but simply because we were waiting for the responses of our request for proposals that we have issued. This means that in our construction operation plan, we are going to include the installation strategies that we have discussed with the vendors that most probably will be involved in the construction of the wind farm. Then after the construction operation plan, there is the final engineering and then, of course, the financial close. New Jersey, let's say that mostly we depend on the outcome of the OREC RFP. We have prepared a detailed schedule to be included in our application, but staying at high level, let's say that starting from scratch, a financial close in 2022-2023 is realistic, but making leverage on the experience and the studies that we have already completed for Maryland, a financial close in 2021 is achievable. And this is important also for the investment tax credit. Now, what are the biggest challenges that we are seeing along the development of the project? The first one is for sure the environment. With environment, I'm not referring just to the migration of the right whales, for example, but everything. So the fishing community, as well as other users of the oceans, like the US Coast Guard or the Department of Defense. I believe that what we have seen this morning is that it is very tough to find a good spot in the lease, because maybe some areas that are good for the fishing community are not the best for the Department of Defense and so on. So with environment, I mean everything, every stakeholder in the ocean. Another challenge is the available port and infrastructure that we have here. There are no areas that are ready and suitable for offshore wind. But there are some nice locations, as I mentioned before. They need to be developed, hopefully with some support from the state. Another challenge is the local content. We have seen from the presentation of the New Jersey BPU that this is important. It is important to achieve a net economic benefit. It means that what we are getting, we have to give in return. And so local jobs and local investments are very important for the development of our project. Here I've included a table coming from our OREC application, and this is just to give you an idea of the impact of a 250 megawatt project on the economy of the area. And the development timeline, this is another challenge because there are some steps that are not directly under our control. For example, the NEPA review that will start after the submission of the COP. What are the actions that we are taking to face this challenge? The first one is for sure early engagement. So we are trying to have a direct communication with every stakeholder involved in this process. I can share that we are discussing, for example, with a group of environmental NGO. I believe Catherine is here in the room. We are trying to define all the activities that we are going to have on our wind farm, and we are listening to them, so we are collecting their feedback. The goal is to reach an agreement, to sign a memorandum of understanding where basically the developer is aligned with the environmental groups. This means possibly additional restrictions compared to what we will normally receive. But as I said, it is important for us to try to make everyone happy as much as possible. Available port and infrastructure, well, we are trying to define as much as possible all the requirements. We are discussing with our vendors in order to find the best locations for our activities. Local content, direct line of communication with both tier 1 companies and local minority companies in order to see if there is a possible involvement for them on our project. And that's all.
All right, next up I'd like to ask Martin Goff with Empire Wind to talk about the work they're doing off the Rockaways.
Yep, good afternoon everyone. My name is Martin Goff and I'm the permitting manager for Equina Wind US, where I'm responsible for permitting our lease in the New York Bight, and I'm here to give you an update of where we are in the development and progress for this particular lease. So as a bit of a sort of background, who are we? Well, we're a global energy company where renewable energy is part of our energy mix, both through existing experience where we have constructed and operated wind farms in Europe, but also sort of part of our growing part of our business in that we have a pipeline of several gigawatts of pre-consented projects that we are going to develop further, plus our lease here in New York, which is what I'm here to talk about today. But just a couple of sort of key updates since my last task force update, which was back in May. First of all, we've had a name change. Most of you are probably familiar with that. I think George pointed that out, that we've changed from Statoil, you previously know us by, to now Equinor. So that's the first point. There hasn't been a sale, we haven't sold the lease, there's no new team, it's the same company, a new name, and that new name basically reflects our direction in this particular industry. And the second update is that since the last task force is that one of our other wind farms, Arkona in Germany, is now fully constructed and operating. So we now have over a gigawatt, 1.1 gigawatt of operating, generating capacity out there, supplying green energy to over 1 million homes. And we're taking all of that experience with us into this process. So a bit about the New York Bight wind lease area. This is the lease, and just to clarify, this is a pre-existing lease. We've been through the leasing process. We've signed the lease terms for this, and this is separate to what's going on with the task force today. So this pre-existing lease is just off of Western Long Island and off of northern New Jersey, so it's right there to supply both the New Jersey and New York markets. We still expect that there's a potential generating capacity out there of up to 2 gigawatts. That will change as we get to know more about the sites. And we still think that we could possibly develop this out in several phases of wind farm projects. And that's probably reflected by certain conditions out there, such as when the power offtake contracts come, the grid capacity, the supply chain, trying to understand the different environmental conditions out there. So it's likely to be a phased development, and we're going on a design envelope type basis in that we're looking at multiple options for infrastructure out there so that we can future-proof this project and sort of set the terms for a sort of longer phased approach to development. We also think that we're well positioned to sort of feed into both New York and New Jersey markets, and so on that basis we have applied for interconnection requests into both the New York and New Jersey grids, and we are currently maturing our offshore cable routes to both states as well as the onshore routes for those. In terms of schedules and our progress in the permitting sense, so starting on the site assessment plan, or the SAP, we carried out the surveys, the assessments, and submitted the SAP in spring of this year, and we got the SAP approved last week. So we are currently preparing to deploy our buoys in the coming weeks. That's one floating LiDAR, a met-ocean mooring, subsea current meter mooring, plus another LiDAR in the future once it's come back from calibration. So we're pleased to get those out in the water. In terms of the wider permitting, the construction operation plan and other state and federal permits, we're busy working on that with the surveys, the assessments, the technical details, the consultation, and currently we expect to be putting in our COP in summer of 2019, so July or August of 2019. And based on the typical sort of review processes of that, we expect to have a COP in place by the end of 2021 and be in a position somewhere around about 2022 to start construction, with operation first electricity coming around about the 2024 mark. But in order for us to have that go ahead to actually do that construction, we need somewhere to sell our power to. And so we're encouraged to see that both New York and New Jersey are going ahead with these solicitations. And so we'll be actively entering into both of those auctions this winter. In terms of an update on some of the work to date, and just for all your awareness, I'm an environmental and permitting manager, so I'm very heavily weighted on the environmental side. There is a backroom staff of about 15 to 20 engineers that do a lot of their engineering stuff, so apologies if I don't cover that. But from the environmental side, we've just completed a year's worth of monthly digital aerial surveys of wildlife out there, so marine birds, marine mammals, sea turtles, large fish assemblages, and all of that data is available on that website link there, so you can go in, look at the data. You can download the monthly reports, and soon we'll have the final reports out for viewing there. We've also been carrying out some extensive geophysical and geotechnical surveys out on the lease for about the past 6 months. So we've tried to survey every square inch of the lease area so that we only do it once. We've nearly completed that. We have 50% of our cable routes surveyed, and we have completed some preliminary geotechnical surveys. And now we're using all of that data to feed into our design basis and into how we plan the site and then into our impact assessments. We also plan to get the Met-Ocean FLIDAR buoys out in the coming weeks, which will obviously give us the wind resource data, but also some very useful Met-Ocean data. And again, a lot of that Met-Ocean data we are willing to make available where it's not commercially sensitive. So we heard today about some cold water fronts and some unknowns around that. And if we can help with our temperature data to help feed into those assessments and give some more insight into that, then we're very willing to do that. We want to share as much data as we can throughout this process. Moving on to the top right, from the fisheries perspective, we've been working on taking the initial feedback from the fishing community to develop some layout rules and some layout constraints on where we can build a wind farm and how we can design it in the early phase, to then take that into the next level of consultation to really solicit feedback on those layouts. So we're working with the Fisheries Technical Working Group, we're working with RODA, and all sort of individual fisheries groups not represented in those forums to consult over the coming weeks and months on those layouts to see whether there is any further mitigation or spatial planning that we can apply to those. We've also been working on our shipping and navigation side of things. So we've been looking at some sensitivity around buffers of the wind farm to shipping lanes. We've been consulting on that, and then we've been taking all of that feedback into the next process, which is the full navigation and shipping risk assessment. We expect to have that complete in January of next year, and then we'll come out and consult on the early results of that and see whether there's anything else we need to do to take it back into that particular assessment. And then giving my engineers a bit of a shout out, the bottom middle picture, they are working tirelessly on foundation designs, on turbines, on ports and infrastructure, how we're going to actually operate this particular project. And so that's all been going along in the background steadily, and this all feeds into the whole planning and impact assessment basis. So I'm collecting all the information on who uses the site, what uses the site, taking all that information from the engineers, and then coming up with some impact assessments and then what mitigation we can use to deconflict that. And so it's an ongoing basis, and we look forward to consulting with many of these groups here individually over the coming months, as we have in the previous coming months. And if there's anyone that needs to contact us, then we have our contact details here of both the onshore and offshore permitting, the stakeholder manager, and our fisheries liaison officer, Steve Drew. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, and then our last speaker from the development community is going to be Kevin Noblock, who is president of Anbarak, and I will get his presentation up here momentarily. Kevin, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bennett, and wonderful to be with everybody today. It's been an illuminating and engaging day. Just a word about who Anbarak is, if you're not familiar with us. Anbarak's a clean energy developer. We have the distinction of having been party to leading groups that have successfully developed two merchant transmission lines bringing electrons from northern New Jersey, one into Long Island, the Neptune project, and one into Midtown Manhattan, the Hudson project. In both cases, these projects were completed on time and on budget. In both cases, the cable was buried for their entire length under the sea or under the ground. So our project is really proposing an open access, planned transmission backbone for offshore wind. And we feel strongly that the time is now to be thinking through how we plan the transmission that ultimately will bring north of 10 gigawatts in commitments up and down the Atlantic seaboard into the onshore grid in a way that grid managers can get to load centers and definitely manage without very expensive, significant upgrades. And so you'll see here a representation of our New York, New Jersey ocean grid. The basic idea is to station collector stations adjacent to the wind energy area leases, roughly 20 miles offshore, to which 2, 3, 400 megawatt wind farms could plug into, and that allows us to bring fewer cables to shore. A key understanding in all of this is that the number of existing substations onshore in New York and New Jersey that can handle a significant injection of offshore wind electricity without significant upgrades are few. And it's very important that we maximize the utility of those substations and minimize the conflicts and the impacts on fisheries, on the environment, and so on. This is really a representation of some of the arguments that we've been making. We think that if we think through a planned approach to transmission that's open access, which would, by the way, reflect decades-long policy on the terrestrial grid side, as represented by FERC policy, that it actually would enhance and accelerate the ability to meet the governor's goals in New York and New Jersey. It would send a powerful signal to the supply chain aspects of this industry that these states are very serious about delivering on these goals, and that these companies should be locating in these states. We think by opening up competition, it will reduce costs. I've talked about the efficient use of limited interconnection substations. And then maybe for the most important point to make today, given what this meeting has been all about, is that as we think about the concerns within the fishing industry, within the shipping industry, within concerns about marine species, impacts on marine species, and so on, we think this approach will actually minimize those impacts by minimizing the needed infrastructure. So our project status, we submitted a grant, a right-of-way, right-of-use easement application to BOEM back in April. BOEM determined in June that we were qualified as a legal, technical, and financial entity to in fact hold such an easement. The next step that we're eagerly awaiting is BOEM would publish in the Federal Register a request for interest to solicit public comment on the grant application. And for the developers and others in the room who may have these concerns, I really want to stress that this grant is non-exclusive and would not interfere with offshore wind developers' rights or prevent other transmission grant applications. Very important note to make. In terms of our project status, our basic approach has been to advance advance process steps, advance our assets across the multiple levels and layers, so that when the opportunity comes to compete to build an open access transmission, that we are well down that pathway and can help accelerate the whole process. We have completed initial geophysical surveys in federal waters. We've completed initial geophysical surveys in state waters relevant to our Rulin Road and Dean's substation interconnection requests. And really what we're trying to do in those surveys is characterize the seafloor along those potential routes and avoid hazards and environmentally sensitive features. We have a number of interconnection requests in New York and New Jersey. Again, we've done a lot of work trying to identify where those optimal substations exist today, where you would need at most modest upgrade investments. And these bullets are really trying to show you our philosophy in taking the approach that we're taking, that we're really trying to put forward a proposal that will make the best use of the limited routes to shore. We've had a lot of conversation today about how intensely busy and complicated the sea routes are. And it doesn't get any simpler once you get on shore. And the approach really is to provide offshore wind generators in both the first and the subsequent phases in these two states with studied interconnections into the complex onshore substations in New Jersey and in the NISO zones J and K. And again, our approach is really open access to reflect the time-honored traditions of separating generation and transmission and ensuring that every generator has access to the transmission infrastructure. And then lastly, the next steps, the phase one in New York and New Jersey are proceeding as we've been talking about today. Our expectation is that it will be in phase two, where there's a tremendous opportunity for the decision makers in these two states to create a competitive opportunity to compete, to build, propose and build an offshore wind transmission backbone. And then you'll see up on the slide a few other steps related to BOEM. So thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Sorry, question. Actually, Kevin, could you hang on for 1 second? I think there's a question, please. And another. No, let us get you a microphone, actually. But over here first, and then go ahead.
Can you just repeat the number of megawatts each one of those substations could handle? The offshore ones.
Well, the collector stations, as we've been working with vendors to design, could handle any single one of them, 2 or maybe 3 400-megawatt wind farms.
Thank you.
So you can, if we're talking about 400-megawatt wind farms, obviously that would be 3 cables that would be reduced to 1 heading into shore.
My question is your predecessor, one of the ideas of a backbone was to provide another emergency way for electricity to get up and down the coast. So if we had another Sandy or something like that, we could get electricity through that backbone. Is Ann Barrack thinking of that as well? Because from EPA's standpoint, we thought that was a good idea. As long as you were doing one, if it could serve another purpose, that would be good.
It's a great question, and you're referring to the Atlantic Wind connection, of course. Absolutely, that when such a backbone is completely built out, you could really build in redundancy, resilience, reliability considerations. Now, because the state of play is state by state, and you see today we're representing it as New York, New Jersey Ocean Grid, which is as we've applied it to, as we presented it to BOEM, out of necessity, we then need to break that into 2 pieces for New York and New Jersey. And ultimately what we're trying to encourage is that decision makers in the states are thinking that far along. At the moment, the way it's constructed, it'd be hard to see how we would secure the financing to build, for example, a redundancy connector between two key cables in the system. But there's no question that is a really attractive part of this approach, especially as we'll continue to see increased intensity of tropical storms, storm surges, and the like. And by the way, since I had the chance to come back to the microphone, I did want to applaud the BOEM team. I know from my own experience in serving in government that it's a great responsibility to look out for the public interest and to capably and responsibly implement the statutes and authorities. And it's been fabulous to see how seriously and carefully the team takes all of this work. So taking advantage of incoming. So back to the microphone.
One more question. Don't go yet.
Thank you. Can you discuss any mitigation plans or ideas that you have for fishing community with some of these cables and this backbone system that you're proposing?
Yes, and we're on the front end of our outreach to the fishing community. We're very eager to ramp that up very quickly. My sense is that there's a real opportunity through such an approach to choose where to lay the cable, where to run the cable in, and so on, in a way that reflects the concerns of the community. There are a whole range of issues. I know some of these so-called concrete mattresses, which is one of the great oxymorons of the industry, where when you're laying seabed cable and you come upon a significant rock outcrop where you have to go over it, the current technology where you lay a concrete mattress on it. But we know that some of the dragnet members of the community are concerned about that really damaging their netting and so on. Well, it turns out that there are some technology options that are being developed that maybe can be accelerated in terms of more of a kind of rubber-like membrane and some other strategies. So we're just on the front end of that, but top line, minimizing the number of cables going through key fishing beds and fishing areas. But then we're very aware there's a whole range of subset of additional issues that we can work through.
Okay. Okay, now you really can go.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Sorry, that sounded really harsh. You're welcome to stay. All right, so at this point, I would like to ask Luke to come back up here and give us a sense of, again, sort of what comes next, both for the wind energy areas and then with the proposed sale notice once the wind energy area is finalized. So, Luke. Thank you.
So hopefully by now, folks are familiar with our process slide here and can understand that there are several stages involved. We are in that planning and analysis stage right now and do have leasing, site assessment, and construction operation to look forward to in the future. A couple things I just want to point out here. While there will be formal public comment periods where you have a Federal Register and there's a mechanism to submit comments as part of the proposed sale notice and also likely part of the environmental assessment, the door is always open to comments to BOEM, and we're certainly willing to take your information at any time. It would not necessarily be part of the formal public record like a response to a formal public notice would be, but we're certainly willing to take that information. And just a piece of information I want to share, I was chatting with some folks from the data portals, the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic data portals. Apparently these draft wind energy areas are now up on there, so you guys take a look at that and compare that to some of the data that's already up there. And also, as Bennett, you mentioned, the slides and recording this meeting will be posted on our website too, so hopefully that'll help with our information moving forward. And this slide here just really shows, again, the road ahead, what we're looking forward to. And really this is a very important point in our process, getting information from the task force. We're going to take that information back, develop an internal strategy moving forward to brief throughout our building and come up with some final wind energy areas early in 2019. And as we mentioned before, when those wind energy areas are announced, that'll also likely coincide with a notice of intent to conduct an environmental assessment on those areas. And that will be followed by a proposed sale notice, likely in the summer of 2019. And again, the key thing to remember there is that's where you actually would see the lease area. And not necessarily the wind energy area, but the lease area that could potentially be within that, as well as a potential lease with that. So lease terms would be included there in a proposed manner, and we'd be looking for comment on that. Once we adjudicate those comments, we'll actually For that, we'll publish a response to the comments. So each of the comments that are received will be responded to in some manner that will be posted on our website. We'll post a final sale notice, and that'll have more of the details about how the actual sale will happen, who qualified as a company to participate in the auction, and then a lease sale or auction in early 2020. So that's kind of the road ahead. Hopefully, folks have a grasp of that, but can I answer any questions at this point to the specifics of where we're headed?
Oh, thanks, Luke. When along this road ahead would you likely have additional task force meetings?
Great question. Likely would probably be with the proposed sale notice. Historically, the program has taken a couple different approaches, but one of them has been to release a draft proposed sale notice to the task force, get some comments on that, and then actually publish the PSN. But likely around that time period is when you can expect a task force meeting. There's also potential for public meetings to occur with the environmental assessment. So much like the public meetings we conducted this September series around the New York Bight.
Other questions for Luke? Anybody? Okay.
Okay.
So if not, Jim, if you hang on one sec, I'm going to let Jim make some closing remarks here in a minute, and I am not going to attempt to regurgitate what you all talked about today, or even in that last session, but I think the ideas that came out in response to those three questions were really, I think they did a good job of getting their arms around a lot of the themes that came up today. I will just reflect a couple of pieces that sort of stuck with me based on what I heard across those three questions. And again, this is not any attempt to be exhaustive, but I'll say, first of all, really clear that there's a lot of interest and need to hear back from Department of Defense, Coast Guard on their ongoing work, and that will provide a lot of clarity and a lot of import to the decisions that BOEM has to make. Equally, sort of in bright lights, was a lot of different ways folks wanted to take a sharper look at some of the fisheries data, whether that's understanding how the rotational impacts of fisheries may be showing movement in catch and value over the course of different years, looking more closely at the elephant trunk and the impact on the scallop fishery, cumulative impacts, species-specific stuff like black sea bass. So just a lot of different areas that people wanted to look at. A number of comments that were just around the challenge of the uncertainty in this process and trying to make decisions and move a process forward when you don't have perfect information. And some suggestions around considering ways to front load some conversations, whether that's with developers around mitigations before COPs, but just how do you, anything that can be done to remove some of that uncertainty will be helpful to the process. Along those lines, a number of comments around really helpful to see BOEM's prioritization process as it moved from the call to the draft wind energy areas. And again, that sort of transparency is appreciated and helpful. And the more folks understand that, the better. A little bit of an inevitable tension between the need to trim some of these draft wind areas based on interests and conflicts, and at the same time, really large procurement goals coming out of New York and New Jersey, and there's a tension there. And how do you manage that? How do you deal with that? So, and then lastly, I'll just say a number of comments around looking at the impact of jobs, both on the concerning negative side, impacts to fisheries and fishermen and ports and shoreside businesses, and on the upside, look at that, a whole new industry. And so what does that tell us, and are there ways to ensure that fisheries can benefit from that and not be harmed by that? And so there's just a whole bunch of there to unpack and better understand. So I'll just leave it at that, and I want to just thank you all for a really good, thoughtful conversation over what's been a very long day. I will invite Jim up here to make some final remarks, and then we will turn to public input.
Thank you, Bennett. And yeah, we want to go to public input, but I do want to make the point that I want to first thank everybody for being here. We've still got a lot to think about, as was demonstrated as we talked over the course of the day. All of your input will be very, very useful. I do want to thank the key players here, the state of New York and the state of New Jersey in particular, for a couple of things, and let them know in the case of New York, that we hear you with regard to the small areas and the fairways. We certainly are going to be taking that into consideration. We also hear you when you basically say, go big. But you're also saying, do it right. And that's the way you've done it, and that's the way you've been providing input to us, and it's critical, and it's extremely valuable to the process. I want to also note, I appreciate New Jersey's point about how the timing of our sale is consistent with the competitive solicitation that you're pursuing, and that kind of consistency, both for both states, is again critical to this process moving forward. This program is moving to a large extent because of that proper coordination between federal and state entities, as is evidenced by the successes that we're pursuing up in Massachusetts. I also want to note with regard to New Jersey about the mitigation. There is nothing wrong with pursuing the idea of mitigation and identifying it now. It is going to be implemented through the leasing process, but the earlier we start to talk about that, the better off we'll be, and the sooner we'll be able to get to where we need to be. And of course, we will, of course, accommodate your request for two weeks for additional information. We will accommodate anyone's information as best we can through the process, because it's very important to us that we have that information to move forward. So we have a lot of factors to take into consideration. I think everybody recognizes that we place a lot of value. There's tremendous value in renewable energy, but we also recognize that there's tremendous value in fisheries, and there's tremendous value in navigational safety. I urge you to continue to participate with us in working towards balancing those values and integrating those values into a cohesive process. So we've heard from the feds, we've heard from the states, we've heard from the developers, we've heard from fisheries, task force members. So I just want to say thank you again and turn it over so that we can hear from the public and the additional stakeholders involved in the process. And thank you very much.
Jim. So if folks can sit tight, we will come back to the public and invite folks to share some of their thoughts. Again, feel free to share any thoughts on any of the issues that have been talked about. If during the small groups up here you talked about some of the issues as well, would love to hear about it. And let me first invite folks who didn't have a chance to talk at first, and then we'll invite others. So I think I see a gentleman over here. And if you could start with your name and affiliation, and I would ask folks to limit their comments to 2 or 3 minutes, if you could, please.
I'm Guy Simmons with Sea-Watch International. Sorry about that. I didn't
You
mean
might
to
not need the
startle
mic. No, go ahead.
I want to go on record. I'm glad you mentioned uncertainty, because I think all of the fishermen in this room have been a part of spending millions of dollars in cooperative science for our assessment process. So we're used to doing science, and we're used to running our business by science. So I'm glad you mentioned uncertainty, because as we go through this process, we're worrying about a lot of things that we wouldn't have to worry about if we had a little bit more direction. And it may not be time for direction, but a few notes that I made that would clarify a lot of things for us. One, can we fish within the arrays with a minimum of 2 nautical miles apart, as well as the secure buried cables? Those are 2 big issues. We're a hydraulic dredge fishery, so we're probably going a little bit deeper than everybody else, about 12 inches. The scallop guys are raking the bottom. So we don't want to grab a hold of a 30,000 volt cable and pull it up with our dredge. One of our big questions is the cold pool. The fragility of the cold pool is frightening. How will the turbulence from wind turbines affect the mixing, which could have negative effects on the cold pool? That is like one of the biggest questions that we have, because I don't believe there's a cold pool like it anywhere else in the world. So we can't really go somewhere else and say, what's the effects? We see effects, storms. In the summertime, when the cold water is starting to warm up, quahogs will start to bury themselves and go into hibernation, waiting on that winter cold water to come back through. Seismic energy and the effect on spotting of all marine life, particularly bivalves. There's already some studies that have been done on that. And for the same reason, the electromagnetic field, how is that going to affect spawning and larvae? Turbidity from the wind turbines, how's that going to affect the food source and the ability for bivalves to eat, for squid to eat, for finfish? One of the things that I learned today was the clouding of radar. Is there something that we should be looking at now to protect the safety of our vessels and our crew, some type of radar system that we all may need to go to? It's inevitable that when wind energy is coming to the New York Bight. I would echo, we'd love to hear more from Coast Guard and the DOD. When I walked back in after we played the game outside, I heard some really great questions and comments from the tables, so I would commend you folks because a lot of that echoed some of the concerns that we had. I would like to close with, I don't want to say slow down, but I like to do it right. Let's do it now. We're talking about decades and decades and decades. So I think sometime, I'm thinking a few years, to get some science done. And I'd like to see some of that $68 million lease money go to science, whether it's the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, whether it's Rutgers University. I think Rutgers is kind of out front on the cold pool right now, so we want to support that. And I want to thank everybody for your participation.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. I'll keep going back here. Again, start with name and who you represent.
John Harron, Northeast Fisheries Sector 13. I was surprised I didn't hear more about the decommissioning plan for these turbines going forward, especially from the environmental groups. We'd like to see that there's an option or there's a plan in place that it's going to be put back into pristine, similar environment that it came from. We'd like to see that there's enough bond to secure that. And we also know that probably there's not going to be enough bond that someone's going to default on it in 20 years. So we'd like to see the electric company, the purchasers of the electricity, pick up the bond after someone defaults. So once again, it'll be put back for future generations. We here are stewards of the environment, so let's do it the right way. Protect the environment going forward and through the whole process. Thank you.
Great. That's the second time today this issue of decommissioning has come up. And Luke, I think it'd be helpful to say a word or two about that.
Yeah, John, thank you for your comment. I think the folks that generated our regulations in their wisdom had generated really trying to address that exact question. And every time there's something put out there on the Outer Continental Shelf, we do require supplemental bonds to have that decommissioned. So whether it's a buoy anchor in terms of a site assessment activities or a tower, or in place of a COP, we do require that once the project is, the useful life of the lease is completed, that we have the seafloor restored to its previous conditions.
Good. Fair enough. Hang on, Bonnie. Just going to see if anyone else who hasn't commented wants to jump in. All right, then, Bonnie, you get the last word.
As people run for the door. A group of us representing New Jersey and clam fisheries and trawl fisheries and scallop fisheries were speaking while you all were convening, and I looked through the list. Some of these things are the same, but regarding the first question, BOEM has said we can fish in the wind energy areas, that BOEM and the U.S. Coast Guard will not create any regulatory barrier to commercial fishing. Yet NOAA NIMS has said for their trawl surveys, they will lose large areas that they will not be able to survey in. If the trawl survey cannot fish in those areas, why would BOEM think that we can? We've learned ecological and biological impacts have no real standing in this process, short of an ESA classification. We've learned that the Coast Guard will lose their ability to do their safety as their first priority job within the wind energy areas if they have no regulatory authority regarding transit lanes and other issues. As far as changes to minimize conflict, number one on the list, this is shocking, I know, remove heavily commercially fished areas from consideration. As far as additional information needs helpful in identifying lease areas to minimize conflict, working with National Marine Fisheries state fisheries agencies, commercial fishing industry to improve metrics for commercial fisheries importance so as to exclude areas of highest value to each port and gear type. There should be studies regarding socio-ecological ecosystem studies, cumulative negative impacts to commercial fisheries, proper maps and landings data, including DOF fisheries, include past studies as the New York Department of State Atlantic Ocean mapping. Shout out to Mike Snyder if you're still here. There you go. Done 2001 to 2010 for all federally permitted vessels within the New York Bight. A lot of great info in there. Let's see, what else? And also, they should show the time effort among ports and states for all fisheries, plus the potential food production effort that is masked by regulatory requirements, which is not a true indicator of future landings. I know there's a gentleman that spoke to decreasing fisheries, and depending upon, there's over 340 spatial regulations the National Marine Fisheries Service has upon us, so even if we'd like to catch the fish, we can't always do so. Also, I'd like to see an update of all BOEM metrics to include new megawatt turbine size and scientific studies matching them. BOEM's own PEIS used 2007 data with an assumed 5 megawatt turbine power limit up until 2014. The science studies that were referred to in some cases had only a 2 to 3 megawatt maximum turbines for reference for all ecological and biological consequences. Clearly, if you're dealing with the pile driving issues of 2 to 3 megawatt turbine and now they're going to be 12, that's a much different issue. And the historic studies that are used in the PEIS don't reflect that. Last, the need for the fishing industry is to create a coast-wide, comprehensive mitigation, scientific monitoring, and compensation plan for displaced fishermen, working with NIMS, Northeast Fisheries Science Center, ROTA, Commercial Fishing Industry, utilizing NIMS study fleet for baseline monitoring studies pre, during, and post-construction, to be applied to all wind energy area leaseholders prior to COP approval. The Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act has a contingency fund only for oil and gas. There was nothing written in for offshore wind because offshore wind did not exist at that time. As a result, we've got bubcus. And I can guarantee, short of the fish themselves or the marine mammals, we are the #1 on the endangered species list if all of this goes through without any help. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Bonnie. Any other members of the public care to comment? All right, if not, let me just say thank you, everybody, for what's been I know it's been a long day, but I think it's been a really thoughtful and informative day. So thank you all very much, and good luck on your way homes. Thank you.